When I first started, within my first week or two in the job, I got phone calls from a whole group of people. And among those phone calls, the head of the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency in the United States, called DARPA, called and said, look, we're letting the contract to a guy at the University of Southern California to coordinate the numbering system of the internet, the IANA. And we want out of it, you know, where there's lawsuits, there's everything. And the head of the University of Southern California, the president of the university, called and said, we don't want any part of this anymore. We're being sued by 5 different groups. And in fact, when we looked at it, there were over 50 lawsuits working their way through courts all around the world challenging the way the internet handed out names and numbers. And the Commerce Department was then letting out the contract for domain names to a company called Network Solutions, which was later bought by VeriSign. And Network Solutions, the heads of that company, didn't like, nor were they liked by John Postell, who ran out at USC, so they weren't talking to each other. And then all these lawsuits were going on, and I got visited by a number of companies who said, look, we'd like to invest in the internet. We think there's real potential here, but there's just no predictable environment for it. And so at that point, we then formed a framework for global electronic commerce, a report. And within the course of about a year and a half, we negotiated a number of international treaties with the EU, Japan, Australia, and others to keep the internet free of tariffs and also to protect copyrights on the internet, and also to recognize digital signatures as being legal in all of the countries in a common format. And we also passed major pieces of legislation in the US Congress to allow for the internet to take off, the Internet Tax Freedom Act, so that we kept taxation off of internet commerce. We passed something that allowed for internet telephony not to be regulated by the Federal Communications Commission, so that internet telephony could grow up in a market-driven way. Passed legislation to protect the copyrights and ratify the treaties, and for digital signatures. And it was a time in Washington, I would say, that was as partisan and divisive as the time we have today. In fact, there had been a government shutdown in a dispute between the White House and Congress, and the Republicans in Congress. And it was leading up to an attempt to actually impeach President Clinton by Republicans in Congress. So it wasn't exactly the friendliest environment. But we managed to keep the internet legislation out of that politics. And every bill we sponsored had leading Republican support as well as Democratic support. Newt Gingrich, who was a leader of the House Republicans, a guy named Chris Cox on the tax committee in the Senate, Orrin Hatch, who was involved with copyrights, and Spencer Abraham, who was involved with digital signatures and so on. And every vote we had passed with 70 or 80 votes, and in the Senate out of 100, and 2/3 in the House. And so we were successful in getting this done, and we kept it under the radar. In fact, we even asked President Clinton not to talk about it in his speeches or in the State of the Union speech, because if he did, we feared that it would become partisan, that people would feel they had to attack it, that he shouldn't take credit for this. It should be something done across the whole government. And it worked. And at that time, we also went through the process to form what eventually became ICANN, because we needed a vehicle that could be global. And remember, at this time, there were more people on the Minitel in France, which was a local French version of connectivity, than there were on the whole internet globally. Okay, so the internet was still very small. But we felt that there needed to be some market-driven, quickly moving vehicle that could embody the marketplace and the multi-stakeholders in the internet, but be recognized by governments so that legally they could withstand legal challenges to what they were doing. And after a comment process and so on, a year and a half, ICANN was born from that process. And it was a first of its kind organization in the world, where you had a private nonprofit organization recognized by governments, with governments playing an advisory role. Now, we did that because we felt that even though we were supporters of the United Nations overall, that the internet needed to be market-driven, it needed to be bottoms-up, it needed to be democratic, and it needed to move quickly. And even though it may seem to you that the processes that you're going through to make decisions on the transition are slow, the typical decision-making at the International Telecommunication Union takes about 8 to 10 years. So if you're taking a year and a half, that's pretty fast compared to normal global decision-making. And so we felt that the internet would be better driven as a multi-stakeholder model, market-driven, than to have it be a multi-governmental body. And also we felt that governments weren't the only stakeholders here. And so while governments were crucially important and should be at the table, they shouldn't be the only ones at the decision-making table. So that's how all this was born. And ICANN started. And if I look back, again, as somebody who then went out of it, because I felt that having been behind the creation of it, it would be wrong. It would be like a conflict of interest to try to stay involved. And so I pulled back and did other things with my life. But as I look back now on the history of it, and I started to become involved again in Singapore when this process first started, because we had originally recommended that eventually the US government should give up its stewardship and that the community as a whole should hold the ultimate accountability. That was a recommendation we made back in 1998, although we recognized it couldn't happen immediately. It would have to take time for ICANN to prove itself and become strong. Now, if you take a look just as somebody who's a layperson, look at what's happened to the internet, right? I mean, the numbers of users have gone up orders of magnitude, numbers of domain names, numbering, hundreds of languages, Wi-Fi, mobile devices, now we're getting to the Internet of Things. And remarkably, you never read something about the internet failing technically to accommodate all that unbelievable growth and all that diversity. You never read about it. Why? Because of the people that are attending this conference and the people that preceded them. The people that run the basic activities, the technical activities and technical coordination of the internet have been able to keep up with all these amazing changes that have occurred and all this amazing expansion, and the internet continues to run seamlessly. That's remarkable in the space of 20 years. And ICANN's existence, 16, 17 years. It's remarkable that that has happened. So let me just conclude what I wanted to say by saying I've observed this process now for the past 18 months or so. And I'm very optimistic now. As often with consensus-making processes, it's had its ups and downs and people yell at each other. The internet community is not known for shy people. And so, there's a lot of strongly held views, a lot of arguments, a lot of distrust. It's also not a community that lacks paranoia at times. And so there's a lot of back and forth, which has been healthy, I think. But there has been a bottoms-up process with comments, with lots of people involved. And I think it's 98, 99% of the way there now to achieving a consensus. I think over the coming days, some people who have strongly felt positions, particularly on the accountability issues and so on, are going to have to be willing to modify those positions some. But I think if the history of the consensus process holds, they'll do so. And we'll get a common proposal that I hope will come in a matter of days, but certainly not too much into the future. And then at that point, the community will write up a good cogent document that it can present to the U.S. government to hopefully follow through on the transition. And the gentleman who will be coming up and later will be coming up to the stage after me will talk a bit about the process from there. But I'm very hopeful that the consensus is just about there. I congratulate the committee chairs and others who've worked on this. It's been a monumental job to navigate all of this through and get it to this point of almost consensus, and I think they'll finish the job in the coming days, and I'm very optimistic about that. I'm also optimistic. I had a very brief chance to meet with some of the staffs, and I'm also optimistic that there is a bipartisan spirit in the U.S. Congress about this, and I'm hopeful that that it'll avoid the kind of politics that are swirling around, and that this will be able to follow through on its merits. Let me just finish by saying that I think what's happening now is historic. You know, if you look back at the way society's evolved, you know, from going to hunter-gatherer economies to farming and husbandry economies, going to industrial economies, those major transitions in human history going back 8,000 years have all been accompanied by changes in governance, changes by the way societies function. And although there's always 2 steps forward, 1 step back, you see increasing democratization as being evident at each stage. And you see that progress always has some cost to it, but that the technical progress always leads to human progress and human freedoms, increases in human freedom, increases in the ability of people to realize even more human potential. The internet revolution that we're going through now is as fundamental as the industrial revolution in remaking human society. And the governance model that you all have been evolving now for the past however many years, 16, 17 years, is going to, I think, form a paradigm for models in the future of how democratic bottoms-up multi-stakeholder processes can coordinate for human good. And so I think the work you're doing now is historic. I'm history, so I'm not going to be involved directly in it, but I congratulate you on the progress you've made, and I urge you to get to that final point of consensus in the coming days and then to follow it through. I think it's tremendous achievement and something you'll always be very proud of. Thank you very much.